My military career began suddenly, without warning, without preparation, and without the slightest desire on my part for such a radical change in my life. A few days after the new year, in January 1941, I was informed by the Military Enlistment Office that I had been drafted into the Red Army and enrolled in its ranks with the rank of military engineer of the 3rd rank in the order, which I received on the letterhead of the People's Commissariat of Defense of the USSR. It was stated that I had to hand over my official files, and on January 15th to report to the Military Enlistment Office to receive documents and leave for the place of destination. The management of the trust, where I worked, made an attempt to keep me at work and to cancel the order of the People's Commissariat of Defense. The director of the Trust Musica went to various institutions, made phone calls to Moscow, to the main Department of Power Industry, to the People's Commissariat of Defense, but without success. The efforts of the chairman of the Kiev City Council, a man with a piquant surname Ubibatko, who acted on the party public line, did not help either. The order remained in force. I do not know how much. There was a sincere desire to keep me in the service on the part of the management of the trust. Probably there was. In the system of our trust, I was considered one of the best installation engineers, and when after several well-conducted works I was appointed chief engineer of the installation of a new power plant in Kiev, it was no accident. The construction of the plant was a strike and was to be carried out by high-speed methods, and I was the author of several articles in the technical journal Heat and Power dealing with this very subject. Besides, I was a senior consultant in the group developing the project of organization of works for this new station, so my candidacy for the position of installation manager was logical. But there was another side to the coin. My past was stained. When, almost immediately after graduating from the institute, I was called up for military service, I already had the rank of military engineer of the 3rd rank. At the institute we all underwent pre-conscription training, formation training, participated in army maneuvers, as well as listened to a number of courses of purely military nature and had to receive credit for them no less than satisfactory. The ranks were assigned by a special commission. Those who were better received military engineer of the 3rd rank, and those who were worse, military technician of the 1st rank. I turned out to be better. Such newly minted military engineers were sent for. A mandatory period of service not to the army units, but to the military industry enterprises subordinate to the People's Commissariat of Defense. We had to work in this system for 2 years, and after this period we were discharged from the reserve and returned to civilian life. I honestly served my 2 years in the construction of a defense plant near Kazan, but when the time was coming to an end, we were all offered to sign a statement that we, military industrialists, expressed a desire to stay in the system of the People's Commissariat of Defense forever. Out of 14 engineers who had undergone 2-year military production service at our plant, 5 people signed these statements, and the rest refused, including me. We were not released, we were persuaded, frightened, insisted, we desperately resisted and demanded to be let go free. I turned into the leader of the resistance movement, but instead of being released, I was arrested and spent almost 9 months in the internal prison of the GPU department on Chernyshevskaya Street in Kazan. I was accused of all deadly sins at once: bourgeois nationalism, chauvinism and separatism, obviously because I received from Kiev the Ukrainian newspaper Proletarska Pravda and various books in Ukrainian. I was accused of anti-Soviet propaganda and agitation directed against the government. This was, of course, a consequence of my chiefism in the group that did not want to stay working at the factory. I was also accused of economic counter-revolution. Why? I could never understand. During my time in the jail, I was called for interrogation 30 to 35 times. Day and night, I received my share of beatings, though without injuries, and then, as suddenly as I was arrested, I was released without a trial, without a formal investigation, but only with a ban on living in the capitals of the republics. I was young, just starting out as an engineer. My social background was quite decent, and there were no suspicious activities in my still very short life. Somehow or other, I found myself back in Kiev in the same trust where I had worked during the last 2 years of my student life and immediately after receiving my diploma, but with a blemish. The head of the special department, who had known me from the moment I joined the trust, showed me a record in my file capable, knowledgeable engineer, good administrator, can be used in responsible leadership work, but under special supervision, politically unstable. When in 1935 the capital of Ukraine was transferred from Kharkov to Kiev, nobody ordered me to get out of Kiev, and I continued to work in the capital. The party circles in the trust were not particularly pleased that the place of the chief engineer of the shock construction site in the capital of the Republic was taken by a non-party, and even politically unstable, but they tolerated it for the time being. However, I felt that the time was approaching when I would be transferred somewhere. I even knew for sure who would take my place. Boris Kogan, a colleague of mine, a good engineer and with a party ticket, was sent to a newly created position of deputy chief engineer. It was very upsetting because I loved my work very much, gave a lot of time to it, enthusiastically implementing theoretical methods of high-speed block assembly in life, achieving positive results and recognizing their cost-effectiveness and efficiency. I particularly felt this flip side of the coin when one day I had to replace the director of our construction, Myron Tovkach, in his weekly progress report to the master himself. Nikita Khrushchev was very interested in the construction of the station. After listening to my report, Khrushchev made a couple of remarks, asked a few questions and gave operational instructions, and then he looked at me point blank with his unpleasant, hard, slightly swollen eyes and said, "Well, you are not a party member and not even a candidate. Why is that? And what did you do there in Kazan? Have you put your brains in place? You occupy a responsible place, you're entrusted with a lot. Look, my friend, don't mess it up. Well, come on, but I don't have time to talk now. But you and I will meet. Go to the construction site." My wife took the news of my going to the army very calmly. We lived almost 10 years, but since she became an artist of the drama theatre, our roads began to diverge. I wanted a family, and she was more and more into the theatre life, her career, by the way, quite successful. It's very sad, but of course I can't go with you somewhere in the middle of nowhere. It would mean to put a cross on my future, on the theatre, and it would be silly to lose my apartment in Kiev. We'll have to live apart for a while. I'm sure that Uncle Tolia will be able to help to get you transferred after some time to the centre, to the district. He has great connections in Moscow. Her uncle was a general of technical troops, worked in the People's Commissariat and lectured at the Frunze Military Academy. Frunze Military Academy. Of course, my wife was right, and I left to live apart in unknown places, in a completely new position, insulted, offended, indignant, lonely and completely helpless to change anything. After spending a day in Minsk, at the headquarters of the Belarusian military district, on January 17th, I found myself in the town of Vysokoye, 25 kilometers from Brest-Litovsk, where there was UMS 84, or the Department of the Chief of Construction, No. 84, where I was appointed to the position of the head of the equipment group in the planning and production department. I felt neither joy nor satisfaction from the high position. At first I was settled in a house for newcomers. This hostel was set up in a house that had belonged to a rich Jewish merchant. It was said that the first tenants of this house, after the Soviet troops captured this part of Poland, discovered a treasure in the wall of some room. From then on, all the temporary residents tried their luck. All the walls in all the rooms had holes in them. The floors were raised. There were no floorboards here and there. For almost a week I lived in this hostel among unfamiliar, noisy, untidy and mostly unpleasant people. Dirt in the rooms, riddled restrooms, inability to wash, to rest. All the time, night and day, someone was coming, going, packing or unpacking, all done with noise, often with arguments and swearing. In the middle of the night there would suddenly be drinking, talking, lewd anecdotes, and then drunken laughter. If they finally calmed down and went to bed, snoring and sniffing did not contribute to rest. UMS 84 was transferred here, to Vysokoye, from Slutsk right after the Red Army occupied western Belarus in 1939. The task of all this construction was to build defences along the new border between Hitler's Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union. UMS 84 was in charge of the works from Brest-Litovsk to Lomsha. Basically all the objects were built along the Bug River. More than 1,000 pillboxes, as the long-term fire points were called for short, were being built along the 200 and more kilometres stretch. Some types were very large, several stories high, with heavy artillery. Groups of pillboxes on a given terrain were located in such a way that, if possible, the whole area was well shot through, and there were no dead zones for either machine gun or artillery fire. Each group consisted of a combination of different types of pillboxes, depending on the conditions and terrain, ranging from simple machine gun nests to command posts with a central power station, its own water supply, telephone and radio stations, staff quarters, kitchen, ammunition and food stores. It was supposed to create a completely impassable barrier. The construction was carried out in a hurry, with the mobilization of a large number of local population. From the point of view of the art of fortification, the whole project was designed very well, and when executed it promised to be very effective in the sense of border defense against the advance of enemy ground forces. It was assumed that if parachute units were parachuted across the defense line and some sections were behind enemy lines, the system should function normally for several weeks. Most of the equipment came from the manufacturers in a ready assembled form. On site, in the central workshops, which were located 15 kilometers away from the administration, at the station Cheremka, only some parts and simple parts were made, such as ventilation ducts, parts of water pipes, various supports, frames, etc. But the workshops were loaded with work not planned, but emergency work. The thing is that the main project, according to which the equipment was manufactured at factories far inside the country, was very often changed in the headquarters, and here at the construction site, already after receiving the equipment. Changing the position of the pillbox on the map, changing the angle of fire, mistakes in concreting entailed a lot of small alterations in the details connecting individual elements of the equipment. There was a rush, a race, telephone conversations, hysteria of the superiors, Avril Scheiner. The chief engineer of UNS 84 was a military engineer of the first rank Liashkevich, a man of undoubted intelligence and knowledge of fortification, but a terrible coward and careerist. The main department of the construction management was the so-called Planning and Production Department, the head of which was Colonel Sokolov, a short-tempered, sluggish and limited-educated cadre saper. I was assigned to the place of the head of the equipment group. Here I immediately fell into a very unpleasant atmosphere. The thing was that the main staff of the whole department, and of course of the Planning and Production Department, was made up of workers transferred from Slutsk. It was a close group with its own methods of work, internal cohesion, long-lasting cohesion, and its group interests. They treated the newcomers, sent from civilian life, unkindly, with suspicion and obvious prejudice. Every order, especially those that gave some kind of innovation, was met with arguments, objections, and references to the fact that we did not do that. All this was aggravated by the fact that my deputy in the group was a military technician of the first rank Krasilnikov, who considered himself offended, bypassed in promotion and insulted, because he himself was aiming for my place. It was very important for him in the sense of career and in the sense of personal prestige and position in this small elite group of Slutsk old-timers. This Krasilnikov, among other things, was a parter of the Planning and Production Department, of course, ANKVD sexist, a great intriguer by vocation, and in general an extremely unpleasant person. The town of Vysokoye, or Vysoko-Litovske, was located 20 kilometers northwest of Brest-Litovske, where the center of the entire Ukrep Rayon UR was located. UNS 84 was a contractor to the UR, fulfilling the orders of the latter. I went to Brest-Litovsk mainly to see the city, famous for the fact that here in 1918 a treaty was signed between Germany and the Bolsheviks, the peace without annexations and contributions. Officially, I went to familiarize myself with the construction of the fortifications. It was here, in the fortress of Brest-Litovske, that extensive work was being done to modernize the fortress, and several different fortifications and pillboxes were being built. The head of the construction site on the territory of the fortress was a familiar to me civil engineer, military engineer of the second rank Yasha Horowitz. I met him at the Scientific and Technical Society in Kiev. Horowitz, it turned out, had also been mobilized, even earlier than me, and had already managed to settle down well here, and even moved his family from Kiev. After the construction inspection and business talks, Horowitz invited me to his apartment for lunch. He occupied a whole house on the outskirts of the city, had a servant, a Polish girl, his own car with a chauffeur. The whole house was furnished very well and richly. Yasha himself, and especially his wife Sonia, were fond of buying expensive and rare things. You can get a lot of things here for next to nothing compared to Kiev. Look at this, I bought these 3 paintings by Maevsky for literally pennies, while in Kiev or Moscow they can easily be sold for 2,000, because they are museum pieces. Yasha showed me his acquisitions with enthusiasm. The dinner was wonderful. There was also a museum set on the table, and the servants served the table. Yasha Horowitz had a good life here. He told me an anecdote, or an actual case in 1939, when the demarcation line between the USSR and Germany was established. In this area it passed along the main course of the Western Bug River, but the main course was between the city of Brest-Litovsky and the fortress on the island, and thus the fortress would have fallen into the hands of the Germans. As if taking this into account, the Soviet command, 24 hours before the approach of the Germans, moved a whole division here, and by the time the Germans arrived, it turned out that the main channel had changed course, went to the other side of the island, and the fortress remained in the hands of the USSR. They say that all 24 hours 10,000 people worked almost only with shovels, but the deed was done. The Germans were very surprised at such a geographically phenomenal case, but swallowed it, laughed Yasha. After a week of torment in a hostel for newcomers, I got a room in the house of a local school teacher. The teacher himself spoke Russian perfectly fluently, but his wife, Mrs. Mogolska, his daughter Rizia, a pretty 17-year-old girl, and his son Kazik, a nimble and very sociable little boy of about 14, spoke with difficulty, despite the fact that a year and a half had passed since these places had been ceded to the USSR. Kazimir Stepanovich Mogolsky was apparently well-educated and well-read, but exceptionally cautious in conversation. Only once he said that in the past, under the Poles, children in Polish schools had more knowledge, because less time was spent on propaganda sciences. He said this, and was terribly frightened. He began to explain his thought in a long and confused way, and finished with a rather propagandistic statement, but it is quite justified and absolutely necessary. It is necessary to restructure the thinking of young people who grew up under capitalism, so that they can be loyal and conscious citizens of their socialist country. So it was not particularly interesting to talk to Mogolsky. The Mogolsky house, in which I got a room, adjoined a large park surrounding the Potocki Palace, or rather, one of the many palaces of this famous family. In the park was a lake. In the middle of the lake was an island connected to the shore by an old stone bridge, and on the island were the ruins of an ancient castle centuries old. Mogolsky said that the first castle had been built here in the middle of the 14th century, then it had been rebuilt and remodeled many times, and since the end of the 17th century it had been completely abandoned. The ruins were now covered with century-old trees, and the remains of the walls were covered with moss and shrubbery. I like to come here in my spare time and sit on the stones, imagining scenes from the long-gone life of Polish knights. Zbyszko, Mr. Wolodyjewski, Zagloba, Kmitic from Sienkiewicz's Fire and Sword were the heroes of these scenes. The new palace was a long, partly two-storied and mostly one-storied building, very simple architecture, without pretensions and luxury. The entire building, outbuildings and services were occupied by the headquarters of the 145th Rifle Division, parts of which were stationed in the surrounding villages and hamlets, out and in the park, and in the streets, and in all the stores of the town there was always a mass of military men, so that one had the impression that it was not a town, but a military camp. Even in the Mogolsky family there was a young Lieutenant Yura Davidov, Lynx's persistent suitor. My work was very bad. Krasilnikov behaved defiantly, clearly trying to provoke me into some rash act. I held back and tried to behave exactly within the service regulations, several times talked to Colonel Sokolov about the need to normalize the work in the group, but Sokolov apparently was afraid of Krasilnikov and did nothing. It ended up that after one of Krasilnikov's antics, I, angry, came to Sokolov and demanded his permission to meet with Chief Engineer Lashkevich and Chief of Department Colonel Safronov. The latter, recognizing his own helplessness, reluctantly agreed. As a result of this meeting, the winner was Krasilnikov. I wanted Krasilnikov to be transferred from my group to somewhere else, but instead of that, my superiors decided to appoint me head of the central workshops and base at Cheremka station. They assured me that this was a more suitable job for me as an administrator and production engineer, and that it was impossible to transfer Krasilnikov to another job because of his party position in the department. In fact, for me it was, of course, a promotion, as there were more than 600 people working in the workshops and at the base, and the superiors were quite tactful, emphasizing this fact in the construction order. The next day everyone read that, due to the administrative unification of the central workshops and the main material base of construction, the head of this new organization, Central Engineering and Material Base, is appointed Military Engineer 3rd Rank P. N. Pali, the same order stated that the time acting head of the equipment group of the Planning and Production Department is appointed Military Technician 1st Rank P. as Krasilnikov. In the end, I was even glad. Away from this cube of bureaucrats and party intriguers, there will be cleaner air. 2 days later I said goodbye to the Mogolsky family and moved to Cheremka. I had already been prepared an apartment in the house of a Belarusian railroader in a settlement near the station. They met me very well and friendly. Until now there were 2 independent organizations on the territory of the base material base and central workshops, which were subordinated in parallel to different departments in the management. Now they were united and subordinated to the department of the chief engineer. Both the head of the workshops, Dudin, a civilian technician, and the head of the warehouses, Intendant Lieutenant Lifshitz, were happy that the time of bureaucratic infighting was over and all disputable issues could now be resolved on the spot, immediately, promptly, in the office of the common chief. From the very first days I was fascinated by the work, in addition to the technical side, which was conducted in the old way, inefficiently, with very low labour productivity, and where much could be improved, required immediate close attention to the administrative and organisational side of the work. Both in the workshops and in the warehouses different groups worked military cadres, half-deprived men from the construction battalions, freelancers from the Soviet Union and freelancers, or mobilised from the local population. These groups were antagonistic to each other by their position, and this caused an endless chain of incidents, trouble and sometimes even fights and scandals. I, by nature, was fond of work if I liked it, and here, in Cheremka, I went into work with my head. I was one of the first to come to work and often returned well past midnight. My assistants Dudin and Lifshitz were also enthusiastic and tried their best to help me in my efforts to establish a common work. The hardest part of the work was the domestic issues. All the cent workers, especially the construction workers, lived in cramped, dirty, completely unsanitary barracks. The food was simply prison-like, half-starved. At the base there was a canteen where all the workers could get lunch, very low quality and limited in quantity, and that was all. Breakfasts and dinners they all had to organise for themselves. In the barracks you could only get hot water, and that at certain hours of the day. Strojbatovci were in the position of almost prisoners, as these military units were conscripted those who, because of their social origin, or because of some sins before the authorities, were not worthy of joining the ranks of the workers' and peasants' Red Army. They lived in separate barracks on an almost prison-like regime and received food 3 times a day. But what food? It was difficult to demand anything from these hungry, angry and poisoned by the authorities deprived. The medical service was outrageously bad. For 600 people working at the base there was a medical station headed by a young doctor mobilized right after the institute, almost without practice. Under his command there were 3 orderlies and 4 nurses working in 2 shifts. The medical station had a room with 6 beds. The sick lay in the barracks, if they had nothing contagious, and the seriously ill were taken to the city hospital in Vysoko-Litovsky or to the railroad hospital in Cheremka. Medicines and all sorts of other hospital material were far from sufficient even for half of the workers. During 3 months of work I, with the help of Boris Lifshitz, who turned out to be a remarkably prompt, businesslike and intelligent man who sincerely wanted to improve the general situation at the base, and a rather influential member of the party, managed to correct and improve a lot of things. There was a great deal of work to be done, but the main thing was that my and my assistants' efforts were clearly producing positive results. There was a noticeable improvement in attitudes among the mass of workers. Labour productivity rose. We managed to get a second doctor for the medical station, and finally, to put the food shop in relative order, and even to open a permanent food stall on the territory of the base. I set up a small bedroom behind my office, and often stayed overnight at the base if I stayed at work for a long time. On the May Day holiday, I got a 4-day vacation and went home to Kiev. On the way, I decided to stop for a few hours in the city of Kovel. This is where I was born. My father was then an inspector and mathematics teacher at the railroad school, and my mother was in charge of an elementary 2-class city school on the outskirts of the city. My mother had a very decent apartment at the school, and there, on Kolodenskaya Street, I was born and lived until the Germans approached and caused a complete evacuation in the middle of 1915. I was then 5.5 years old. I wanted to look at the place where I was born, and for some reason I was sure that I could easily find it from my childhood memory. And so I did. After walking about half a kilometre along the railroad, I saw a tunnel through which the roadway passed, which then turned into Kolodenskaya Street. Here I immediately remembered an incident. It was late fall of 1914. My father, having returned home, said that tomorrow Tsar Nicholas II would be passing through Kovel to the front, and that the railway school, as well as the men's and women's gymnasiums, would meet the Tsar on the station platform. He promised to take my sister and me to this meeting. Toward evening we were returning with my mother from the city by coach. It was raining, damp and cold. In this tunnel my mother saw a small childish figure huddled against the wall. Stopping the coach, the mother recognized one of her pupils, Czezik Poplowski, the smallest, most confused and quietest boy in the school. I sometimes played with him during recess, and he was probably no more than 8 years old. It was his first year at school, and he still spoke Russian with difficulty. When his mother asked him, "What are you doing here, Czezik?" he quietly replied, Krulia Chekam. He had learned from somewhere that a Krul would be passing by and decided to provide himself with a place of observation in advance. His mother picked him up in the carriage and took him to his parents' house. And the next day my sister and I, dressed in the most parade costumes, stood near our father, also in dress uniform, with orders on his uniform and a toadstool on his side, in the formation of the railroad school. The whole platform was occupied by the Sherpa of the educational institutions of the city and all the local superiors. The train approached to the sound of the hymn God, Save the Tsar, performed by a brass band and a large cathedral choir with the participation of the best choristers from colleges and gymnasiums. At the sound of the music and singing, the train stopped, and out of the carriage doors, right against the place where we were standing, came the Emperor. Evidently the first thing that attracted his attention was my sister and me. He took a few steps, lifted my sister's face by the chin, and bending over, kissed her on the cheek, and then passed his hand affectionately over my head, and proceeded to walk along the line, accompanied by a large retinue. I well remembered his face and his affectionate, soft smile. Many times afterward my mother told about this incident, and perhaps even took pride in this supreme attention to her children. Now I found without much difficulty the house where the school and our apartment used to be. There had been few changes in the past quarter of a century. True, the street had been paved and sidewalks had appeared. There were new brick houses in some places behind the school, where there had once been an orchard, and behind it bread fields. There was now a row of 4-story grey buildings. The half of the house where the school used to be had been converted into residential apartments. I stood in front of the house and then entered the courtyard. The appearance of the Soviet commander created a sensation. Curious faces of women and children looked out of all the windows, and several passers-by stopped in the street. I wanted to leave, feeling rather awkward, but an old Jewish man came up to me and asked me what I wanted. I replied that I had just come to see the house where I was born. After a short conversation, the terribly excited old man remembered Mrs. Teacher and the pan himself, and even us children. Beautiful Panokshka, and here is such a Manasini. He put his hand 1/2 meter above the ground, myself. He told me his name and said that all these years he had lived in the same house where he used to live. The old man fussed, even wept when he learned that my parents were no longer alive. Grabbing my hand, he kept saying, "Ah," Such a manisini. Mr. Officer, very important. I hastily retreated, afraid that such an unusual street meeting of the inhabitants of Kolodenskaya Street might be noticed, and then I would have to explain and prove something. I returned to the station and sat in the waiting room until the train arrived. The trip to Kiev brought only disappointment and left an unpleasant feeling that my wife and I were nearing the end of our life together. All 3 days she was terribly busy, a parade performance, then participation in several concerts, then a team meeting dedicated to the upcoming tour in Moscow, and for me, after a 4-month separation, life apart, and there was no time left. At night, when she returned, I listened to her stories about the upcoming trip to the capital and her career hopes, but I did not feel much interest in my present situation and our future together. So I left for Cheremka. My wife could not even see me off on the train. There was no time. At the beginning of June, I made a trip along the whole length of the construction site, from Volinka to Lomsha, in order to organize repair and emergency teams in the field. I saw and learned many interesting things during my short trip. In Brest, pillboxes were built along the very edge of the island. New. According to Yasha Gorobets, the Bug River was narrow, only 40 meters. On the other side of the river, the Germans set up observation posts with optics and cameras. Here look, Pali. When we started to put up the formwork, we built shields so that they couldn't detect the azimuths of the shelling. Then they put up these towers. We raised the shields higher, and the next day they doubled the height of their towers. We had to close this whole side completely, like winter greenhouses. On the other side there was a tall mast with a large red flag with a black swastika clearly drawn on a white circle. On the platform by the mast stood several German military men and looked at the construction site through binoculars. Take the binoculars, Pyotr Nikolaevich, look at them. Especially the officers here are fancy dressed. Sons of bitches. Yasha thrust a large artillery binocular into my hands. I looked at the Germans with interest. The binoculars gave a great approximation, and I could see the smallest details of their costumes, buttons, epaulettes, even the wrinkles on their faces and the colour of their eyes. It was as if these people from a completely different, unfamiliar world were standing side by side. That tall one there in the cap is a major. The epaulettes are twisted silver, around his neck is a black Maltese cross. This is their highest order, like our star of the hero of the Soviet Union. An honoured fascist. I began to scrutinize the honoured fascist. Rough, clean-shaven face of a professional soldier, smartly sitting blue-grey uniform with silver edges, boots with high, as in the Poles' backs. He said something to his colleague, pointing with his hand then at the building, then along the river, and it was strange to see the movement of the lips and not hear the sound of speech. Like a silent movie, I thought. What's that over there under the tarpaulin? They've got a machine gun emplacement, and behind those trees over there, that's where they've got their mortars. And all along the border. And everything is aimed at us. Good buddies. And we poison them with echelon after echelon of timber, coal and grain. 5 or 8 trains pass through Cheremka every day. It's a strange story. If you go farther, you'll see even stranger things, what I don't want to tell you. See for yourself. Then you'll think about the strange things. Everyone knows, but everyone avoids talking about it. Indeed, there was something to be surprised about. When I arrived the next day in Semiotichi and came to the border, to the shore, I saw these strange things at once. On the German side, on the shore, neatly stacked were all the parts and details of a pontoon bridge. Even the pontoons themselves were mounted on rollers, and wooden tracks were laid all the way to the water, and here and further to Drohichin, and near Grodzinsk. The devil knows why this demonstration, said to me the head of the site. They are playing on our nerves. Rumours are going around very unsettling. From above they calm us down, and here these murky rumours are whispered, with hints and innuendos, creating nervousness and anxiety. And so it was throughout the construction. All along the line of the new border, there were rumours about the Germans preparing for something. And everyone was afraid to say what. Officially it was called spreading provocative rumours, and everyone preferred to speak softly, or just keep silent, hiding their anxiety and concern. In Lomsha, I met again with a man from Kiev. Georges Prozan had once worked in the same institution with me, but then he married Zatonsky's niece, joined the party, and quickly rose up the ranks. At one time he was even chief engineer of the main railroad workshops then. After Zatonsky's fall, he almost ended up in jail himself, but somehow survived, although of course he fell from his high place. However, he was not purged from the party. It is very difficult to understand what it is. I'll tell you in confidence that at a meeting of party activists, the speaker from the political department were asked questions about it, and he avoided answering in every possible way. And when one pilot said that he himself had observed the movement of large military formations more than once, do you know what that fool said? You won't believe it. He said that it is quite clear that the Germans are preparing a decisive strike on England, and that here is a build-up of reserves for this strike. Huh? How do you like it? A strike across the Channel and reserves under Warsaw. I, brother, told my Natasha that while she and her children are at home in Kiev, there is no reason for them to come here. Let's wait for 6 months, and then we'll see. Reserves. Oh well, what do you think yourself? How should all this be understood? You're a member of the party, after all. You should have more information, you know, Petya. I can tell you this. We've known each other since the time of the first medalist national team. Since 1926? I regret that I went to the party in my time. Circumstances, hopes, desire to get ahead, and of course pressure from Natasha's family. I paid dearly for it. And now I can't leave. It's impossible. And it is twice as difficult to work as an engineer partisan. You have to lie a lot both to those who are under you and those who are above you. How to understand all this? I think that the Germans will open a second front one day. That's how I understand it. And when that day comes, oh, how bad it will be for us here. There are no forces on the border that can take the first blow and hold on for even a very short time. How far is it from the border to your base? About 25 kilometers. So here's my advice to you when you hear the first shots. Get your rods and get to the rear. Here we won't even have this opportunity. In 15 minutes they will occupy all our plots. Goodbye, Pyotr Nikolaevich. Of course, our conversation was strictly confidential. It is possible that we will never meet again. The feeling of some doom and fear was in many people. The Germans, like a boa constrictor to a rabbit, hypnotized those working on the border with their gaze and the rings of their powerful bodies curled up on the other side of the narrow river. When I arrived home in Cheremka, I found 2 letters from my wife on my desk, one from Kiev and the other from Moscow. This second one was very affectionate and even bored. She wrote that she had already talked to her uncle Tolya, a general, and that he promised to find out what could be done, and in case of a possibility of my transfer to the Kiev district to press all the pedals. These letters revived the hope of returning to Kiev and of ordering our life with my wife, whom I love dearly. Lifshitz suggested organizing a big all-buzz-off picnic to bond the working collective. I liked the idea, and we began preparations. Belovezhskaya Pushcha was chosen as the place for the picnic. It was only 26 kilometers from Cheremka to Gainovka station, and there the forest began. The time of the picnic was set for June 22nd. Under the conditions of Soviet life, any such endeavor had an endless number of complications, difficulties and special requirements, because political requirements were almost always contrary to common sense and, most importantly, to the normal human psyche. The blatant lies of official attitudes and dogmas, to which everyone had long been accustomed back home in the USSR, were all too obvious to the locals who were still inexperienced in the style of Soviet life. Of course, so to speak, the ideological part of the supposed picnic was handled by the secretary of the local party committee, Politruk Pogorov. He was not a bad fellow, calm and good-natured, but an orthodox party scribbler. He had nothing of his own, original, human, but only party orders, instructions, resolutions, and in carrying them out in life he showed incredible persistence and perseverance. Outside of these official functions, he was the most ordinary common man of a small provincial town in Middle Russia. We had to spend a lot of time and labor to persuade Pogorelov not to turn the whole picnic into a series of political lectures and propaganda meetings, but to keep the main goal fun and comradely rapprochement of different groups of workers at the base. The issues of transportation, food, entertainment program, and all other issues were finally successfully resolved, And on Saturday, the day before the picnic, I went to Visokoye to get the final approval of the whole program from the head of the construction department. There was some anxiety, nervousness in the department. The deputy chief approved the whole project of the picnic, not even interested in the details or the amount of expenses. He just wrote "I approve" over the top, and that was all. The chief himself and Lashkevich were summoned to Brest to the head of the fortified area, General Puzarev, for an urgent meeting. I learned that perhaps all the institutions of the construction department would be returned back to Slutsk, and that the summons of the chief of construction and the chief engineer to General Puzarev was connected with this issue. My old buddy Krasilnikov was promoted both in rank and position as sleeper in his buttonhole and approval as head of the equipment group in the planning and production department. Before leaving back to Cheremka, as usual, when I was in Vysoky, I wanted to visit the Mogolskys for an hour, with whom I had always maintained friendly relations, but one of my co-workers advised me not to do so. He told me the Mogolsky family died. Do you remember that Russia was being courted by such a handsome young lieutenant from the 145th Division, who called himself Yura Davidov? Well, he invited her to the evening of May Day, and then took her to the park and beat her up and raped her. We were just sitting at Mogolsky's and playing preference when the poor girl ran home. The next morning all three of us went with Mogolsky to the division headquarters and got an appointment with the divisional commissar. Nothing came of it. The commissar told us that, firstly, Yuri Davidov was not, and had never been in the division lists, neither among the rank and file, nor among the commanding staff, and secondly, that it was none of our business, and it would be better if we returned to our duties immediately. And Mogolsky was reprimanded for trying to smear the image of a Soviet commander. That's what he said, image. And besides, everyone knows that if the bitch doesn't want it, the dog won't jump. That's how you tell your father, isn't it? And that if he, Mogolsky, wants to raise an official case defaming the honor of a representative of the workers' and peasants' Red Army, he must have very strong, indisputable evidence, such as witness testimony and material evidence. What this commissar meant by that, I don't know. Rizia and her mother went somewhere. The boy Kazik was arrested for rushing with a knife and trying to kill some commander in Brest at the train station. It is likely that Kazik found this Yura. He was arrested and taken to Minsk to prison, as if he would be tried there. And Mogolsky himself is now in a state of almost total insanity. I think he'll be arrested one of these days. Such a nice and solid family has perished. I listened to this story completely stunned. And he added, and you know what the worst part is? It's the way our commanders in the department reacted. Not all of them, of course, but the core majority. Instead of condemnation and indignation, there was a kind of approval and even envy. Here's a vagabond. He's had some Polish meat, and the ends are in the water. I couldn't listen to any more, jumped out into the street, got into my gazik and ordered the driver drive to Cheremka. At the base I checked the preparation of everything necessary for tomorrow's picnic, gave the last orders to the garage to have all the transport ready by 8:30 a.m., and went straight through the forest to my apartment. The mood was such that I could neither work nor talk to people. I lay down in the forest, and until darkness I lay looking straight up at the tops of pine trees. Lynxia, poor girl. For the first time in my life I felt an acute desire to kill a person. And not just to kill, but to torture slowly, sadistically. I was ashamed of the country to which I belonged, of the army in which I served, of the division commissar and of myself, who had neither the right nor the courage to stand up for such a bright young Polish girl. After drinking the tea brought by my hostess Aunt Nastya, I went to bed. I dreamt of my father, the first time I dreamt of him after his death in November. He dreamt somehow vaguely. He was standing there, trying to say something, like when he was dying. Only one word was clear: son. I woke up for a minute. An airplane flew quite low over the house. It was a few minutes past 3 on the clock. And there's my father again, walking through the dewy grass, leaving dark footprints. The meadow is so green and verdant, and huge white daisies at the edge of the forest. Father is barefoot, in a grey old shirt without a belt, his pants rolled up below his knees, and in his hand he has a fishing rod. He walks along, smiling slyly. scratching his red beard with his free hand. His smile and the expression of his greenish eyes unusually soft and affectionate, he comes to the creek and steps on the boardwalks, and suddenly the boards under his feet break with a deafening crack and rumble. From this cracking and rumbling I woke up instantly. Plaster was falling from the ceiling, the shards of the shattered window were ringing, Aunt Nastia was shouting hysterically, and the pre-morning sky, which was already slightly lighter, was turning purple outside the window. Time after time close, strong explosions were heard, and with each new explosion, bright flashes, the sky became brighter and brighter. An explosion. A fire. At the base or at the station. It's the Germans. A blow. I dressed feverishly, pulled on my boots, grabbed my harness and pistol belt in my hands, and through the window jumped out into the garden. The Germans are coming, Herrn Flyers. Look here, Chief. The master stood in the garden and pointed with his hands to the gliding shadows of airplanes against the orange-red clouds rising over the station. I stood as if mesmerized and watched the rapidly growing fire. Here we had opened the second front. Zorka Prosen was right. War. Oh, and burning oil depots, sleeper impregnating. Oh, what am I, really? Because my place is at the base. Something must be done immediately. The chief is already waiting there. And I, without returning to the room, ran through the forest to the base. The whole forest was fantastically illuminated by the glow of the fire at the station. In the side of the base, the sky was also getting lighter, but there the dawn was beginning. The dawn of the first day of the war. The closer I got to the base, the more often the figures of running men flashed among the trees. I caught up with some labourer, and he, seeing me, ridiculously raised his hand to his visor and shouted, "Comrade! Comrade, where are the children and the babushka to be taken? What order will you give?" Gasping from running, I stopped near the gate of the base. The base duty officer had already put into effect a special defense plan. At the gate stood a machine gun and a dozen Red Army soldiers in full battle armour with gas masks and helmets. A bunch of workers and servants who had come earlier than me were gathering aside. They were not allowed to enter the base. It was also provided by the special plan, and in accordance with the same plan the lieutenant on duty asked for the password. I answered and ran to my office to the telephone to call Vysokoi. The night duty officer in the office, a junior military technician, almost a boy, badly frightened, confused, reported that almost simultaneously with the first raid called from Vysokoi, and the duty officer on the control transmitted Special Defense Plan, Order 212 in effect. Then he said the Germans are crossing the border, war. Have the base chief immediately call on the emergency wire that was at 4.38. The first raid on Cheremka was at 4.22. All base security personnel were on full alert. The entire base was cordoned off with reinforced guards. Fire and special units would be ready. A paramedic and 2 sisters were already at the infirmary. I looked at my watch. It was 5:10 in the morning. Call emergency control. I picked up the phone. On the phone I could hear talking, yelling, the standard profanity. Someone was shouting insistently, "Crates, green crates. Load them first." The green ones. Finally someone asked, "Who do you want?" And I got a connection to Lyashkevich. Or Palij. The Germans have crossed the border. They're bombing everything. How are you? The a column and we, the control with it, will pass the base around 9.00. Get your men ready to join us. All of you. Proceed on Order 212. Sending liaisons with details. Everyone. One by one Dudin, Lifshitz, Pogorelov, and Senior Lieutenant Borisov, Chief of Base Security, came running in. We began the emergency meeting, but no sooner had I opened it with the word comrades than the air defense sirens howled. We jumped out of the office. The sun had already risen, and in its low rays, brightly lit, pinkly glistening, we could see 4 airplanes flying in a chain from the direction of the border. The planes turned around and all at once went to the base in formation, descending rapidly. I pressed myself against the trunk of a large pine tree. The planes flew low over the base, firing machine guns and throwing light incendiary bombs. The whole base was at once covered with dust and smoke. Fires started in several places. One bomb hit the mechanical workshops building. and I saw a large lathe fly out of the workshops and hang in the air, wedged between the wall of the building and a pine tree growing nearby. Barely had the airplanes passed, the fire chief wanted to run to the fire station. Back under the shelters. They're about to be here again, I stopped him, watching the manoeuvring of the planes. The whole foursome repeated the maneuver exactly. Now they flew out from the side of Isoki and at right angles to the direction of the first attack again, all four rushed toward the base. One bomb exploded near the office, and I went tumbling to the ground, but immediately jumped to my feet. Nervous trembling beat me like a fever, even my teeth knocked small and fractional, and I could not speak. The base was in complete chaos. Fires started in a dozen places at once. Most of the buildings were destroyed. A tanker with gasoline exploded. There were almost no human losses, as there were only guards and fire departments at the base. One Red Army soldier was killed and another wounded. The unfortunate soldier, somehow squealing thinly, was carried on a stretcher to the infirmary. The front man of the stretcher bearers, with a face petrified with fear, approached me and said, "This minute he'll die. This minute, by his breasts, will die." The airplanes had disappeared. It was impossible and pointless to extinguish the fires. 1 or 2 fires could be extinguished, but a dozen. There was no equipment, no people. And most importantly, there was no water. The water pump was broken by a bomb, and the stock in the miraculously survived water tower was not enough for one fire. All the buildings on the base were of barrack type and stood each separately, quite far from each other, so the fire did not spread from one building to another. More than half of the base was burned down. Fortunately, the main warehouse of food, uniforms and small equipment remained untouched, as well as the warehouse of explosives and ammunition, which stood quite apart. There was no communication with Vysoko-Litovsky, neither on the general line, nor on the emergency line. I, after a nervous shock, a purely physical fright and panic, came to my senses, was able to overcome the trembling, acquired the ability to speak, to think and to act. That's it. It's mathematically accurate. Crosswise and the base is gone. It's good that people at work was not, or else there would be more corpses than alive, with a deep sigh, as if of relief, said Lifshitz. There was no communication with the department. Finally we found where the wires were torn, and I called Vysokoi again, answered the duty officer, and transmitted the order of the chief of the department, with available forces to keep the defence of the base until the approach of the column of the UA. Prepare all means to fight possible fires in case of air attack. Prepare the base for possible urgent evacuation of the local population on the base, not allowed in unforeseen cases to be guided by. The order no. 212. Then the duty officer added the URA column has already left Vysoki for Cheremka. We had an attack on the headquarters of the 145th. Brest has not yet been taken. I'm taking off the equipment and will catch up with the column. That's all. I wish you well, comrade engineer. What an order. I thought 52 Red Army soldiers, 2 old Maxim and 5 shot rifles. We will defend the base. To prepare equipment against possible fires, of course, there is nothing to the whole base is burned, but to prepare a complete evacuation that's reasonable. And I gave the appropriate orders, everyone with women and children to gather in the wooded areas on the northern edge of the base. The available motor transport 14 cars, one by one to drive up to the warehouse, load with products halfway, and then there, in the plantations, adding people to the cargo. Firefighters to arm if possible and join the security team in Borisov's order. All remaining buildings, including the explosives warehouse, prepare for destruction. After 7 o'clock in the morning again, flew over the base 3 German planes, one separated from the flock, and, describing in the air a wide arc, flew over the base, dropping 3 bombs and shelling the base from machine guns. 2 of the bombs fell on empty space, and the third toppled a water tower. By 8 o'clock all available vehicles were loaded, taken to the woods and camouflaged, and almost all personnel with wives and children were assembled. The whole base was cordoned off, and I also sent some patrols into the forest and along the roads towards the border. It was quiet and calm, a clear sunny morning, almost windless weather. Modest fires were burning the buildings of the base. It was clear that there was no danger of new raids. Occasionally German airplanes were seen flying by from afar. From the direction of Brest we could sometimes hear some explosions or gunshots. I sat at the gate of the base and kept looking at the forest road towards Vysokoye, not knowing what I would see: a column of UOOR, German soldiers. A few Red Army soldiers under the command of Petty Officer Shuliak, guarding the gate, apparently also thought about these possibilities. On the road suddenly appeared a group of Red Army soldiers, and ahead of them almost ran Krasilnikov. I got up and went towards them. Krasilnikov stopped and shouted Military Engineer Pali to me, "Run." I stopped. Then Krasilnikov hysterically began to just yell to me, "Run. I order you, Engineer Pali." Run. His appearance was more than strange. His gymnospear was dislodged from under his belt, his cap was knocked to the side, his collar was unbuttoned. "What are you, Krasilnikov? Have you had a drink this morning for courage?" I asked softly. In reply, Krasilnikov shouted again, breaking into a falsetto, "No talking. Execute the order." Run, and suddenly drew a nagant from his holster. I was confused for a moment, remembering how recently at the commanders' meeting in the department Krasilnikov made a report on changes in the disciplinary regulations and especially savoured the paragraphs on the right of the commander during hostilities to demand unconditional and immediate obedience to orders, up to the use of physical force and weapons. This idiot really can put a bullet, I thought, and, turning to the gate, shouted Petty Officer to me. Seeing the soldiers running up to me, Krasilnikov obviously came to his senses. What was the matter with him? What caused such extravagant behaviour? I never understood. He put his nagin into his holster and said quite calmly, "I am the head of the vanguard of the column of the fortified area. My car has failed. I am taking yours. The column will be here in half an hour. Provide the car with a reserve of fuel. Execute the order, Comrade Pali." I looked at him. "The order will be executed, Comrade Vanguard Chief, but I will report your hysterical behaviour to my superiors. And I advise you to clean yourself up and drink cold water." I turned and walked back to the base gate. Krasilnikov was given a 1.5-ton gazik, and he left with his vanguard in the back of the truck. It was already 10:30 when the Ura column appeared on the road. The cars were going slowly, at long intervals. Many people were on foot. The column crawled past the base without stopping. I saw General Puzirev in one of the cars. The chief engineer of the department, Leshkevich, stopped for a minute and told me, "All your people join the column. You and your guards stay at the base until you see the infantry barrages from the border begin to withdraw. Then blow up the base and catch up with us. We're going to Kleshik. I'll leave beacons for you. At your disposal I leave 2 platoons of Polbachnikov, Captain Pali." Engineering little left, he grinned, shaking my hand. One of the platoon commanders left to me told me that in the column almost no one from the very management of the fortification, only General Puzirev and a dozen commanders. The rest did not have time for cars. He himself, Konstantin Suvorov, with his platoon was on field training near Vysokoye. Puzirev, on his way from Brest to Vysoky, was taking with him all the units he met. "It seems to me that the general is in a state of panic," said the tall young junior lieutenant commanding the platoon, only because the Komvivod was lost on the way. Again flew by a formation of airplanes, made a circle over the base and flew on, without firing or dropping bombs. Finished the job. "Cleanly worked, left nothing," said one of the lieutenants who came with the column. "And where are ours?" "I have not seen a single one in the air yet, and there were many of them on the airfields. Have they all been destroyed?" Out of the woods came running panting scouts. Their petty officer volleyed them out. "They're coming. The Germans are coming, Comrade Captain. We saw them with our own eyes." An armoured train passed over the bridge, white polish eagles on the cars, and on top of them fascist black swastikas painted on. Infantry on both sides of the tracks. A lot of them on the road and straight through the woods. The infantry barrier is retreating. They'll be here now. And as if in confirmation of his words, in the forest, on the other side of the road, at once in many places appeared the figures of fast-moving Red Army soldiers. I gave the order to gather all my troops at the gate of the base. An elderly senior lieutenant, the commander of the flank, came up and answered my question about the Germans. What is there to talk long, Captain? We and you should run away too. They are following us. They will be here in half an hour. It is difficult to estimate how many of them are coming. A lot. They're slowly combing the forest in chains, afraid of surprises. I didn't fire a single shot. It's very funny. An army on one side, and on the other, and he waved his hand at his men. 50 small Uzbeks with frightened faces were hiding in the bushes by the roadside, looking hopefully and fearfully at their commander and into the forest. Well, to hell with them. Let them go. We're getting away, where there will be at least a semblance of defence. Bye, comrade captain. I recommend you to hurry up, too, if you don't want to speak German. And, waving his hand to his soldiers, walked quickly along the fence into the forest. Borisov, light the fireworks. Fall back. 2 chains in bunches 10 paces apart. We'll go straight through the woods, it'll save time. Follow me, I ordered. At the base rattled explosions, several small ones, and then, covering everything with a rumble, the main one went off. It was a warehouse of ammunition and explosives, a remnant that could not be taken out with the column. Whew, they'll hear that one in Brest too. The Germans will be frightened and will run home. Victory is ours jokes were heard among the soldiers. It was already completely dark when we went through the forest to the place Clichy, where we were waiting for the beacons, and in total darkness we joined the Ura column. Having reported everything that happened to Lyashkevich, I ate and cosily settled down for the night on one of the Bazov cars, on Lifshit's instructions. All my things, hastily stuffed into suitcases, were there, too, thanks to the efforts of Lifshitz. I was awakened when it was still quite dark. The sky was lightening a little in the east. General Puzyrev is summoning the entire command staff. The order is to get everyone up. We'll soon perform, said some soldier who had found me. Major General Puzyrev was a small stature, very fat little man with a round woman's face. He had been appointed to command the fortified area relatively recently. It was said that he was not a bad chief and administrator, but was terribly proud of his rank and demanded from everyone a special reverence for his position. He sat on some crate, sleepy and frowning, and smoked cigarette after cigarette. When all the commanders had gathered, probably up to 150 men, he, without getting up from his seat, said, "Comrades commanders, up to the present moment I have no orders from the command, no communication. We are still on our own, and our task is to break away from the Germans and get in contact with higher commanders of the front or district as soon as possible. Comrade Lyashkevich, a military engineer of the first rank, has a plan, which I have basically approved. Tell me, Lyashkevich, your plan to the commanders." Lyashkevich very briefly and businesslike said that although he had no actual data on the advance of the German forces, logic spoke for the fact that there was a fairly safe road for the retreat of the Ura column. We are now at the southwest corner of the Pinsk marshes. The whole triangle of Brest-Baronovichi-Mozyr is solid swamps. The Germans will not go here. Along these bogs, more than 100 kilometers in the northeastern direction stretches Beloveshskaya Pusha. The Germans will not risk letting their troops into this forest either, and there are no roads there, and they will be very vulnerable there. I think that the Germans in these areas will move to the northeast in the direction of Vilna-Vitebsk, which is to our left, and to the east in the direction of Kiev, which is to our right, on the other side of the Pinsk marshes. On the basis of this, I proposed and Comrade General approved the following plan in an hour. At 5:00, the column will move out in 3 detachments. The first detachment, 2 platoons of Polbat and 15 automobiles. Colonel Safronov commands the detachment. The second detachment, all families, women, children, civilian and non-combatants with 25 cars. The second detachment is commanded by Major Yuzenik. The third detachment, 2 Polbat, security part of the base, 6 vehicles, and all horse-drawn wagons, Commander Captain Krasilnikov. Between detachments keep a distance of half a kilometer. In front of the column, on the sides of it, and in the rear guard barriers and reconnaissance. The column commander is General Puzyrev, who appointed me his operational deputy. Squad commanders, please come to me, the rest in their places. I repeat, we leave at 5:00, direction by Aloyeza, Tikovolia, Volkovisk. Lyashkevich's plan was, of course, very good. I went back to my squad. I found myself in a detachment commanded by my buddy Krasilnikov. It was extremely unpleasant, but no sooner had he hauled his things than I was called back to Lyashkevich. Pali, you and Senior Lieutenant Borisov, on my recommendation appointed personal adjutants of the General, will be all the time with him for communication and transmission of operational orders. Immediately report to the General. Duskily looking at me and Borisov, the General ordered you will be near me all the time. Do not go anywhere without my order. Sit down, one near the chauffeur, the other here to me, and do not talk, and smoke less. The column set out at the appointed time, and in half an hour was fully drawn into the forest under the protection of the age-old trees of the forest. The General was in a sort of half-asleep state. He was sitting in his car next to Borisov and quite often swallowed some pills, obviously, contributing to the fact that he occasionally stopped the car and went out for a small need, and did it absolutely unashamedly, in full view of everyone. At first Lyashkevich reported to the General about everything that was going on and asked his permission for this or that order, but the General did not react to anything, and it ended up that Lyashkevich completely took over the command, without consulting or bothering the General. I and Borisov turned out to be Lyashkevich's direct assistants. By 12 o'clock we had covered only 18 kilometers. We made the first break. General Puzyrev, having learned about the slow progress of the column, was very dissatisfied and ordered to reorganize the entire column. The cars were unloaded so that everyone could sit on them. Everything unnecessary was dumped and destroyed. Only fuel, food and sanitary supplies were left behind. Everyone was placed in the cars. Horses and carts were left with the forester. The main thing is to reach our own, to join the army. This is our task. Lyashkevich, move forward as soon as possible, and the General again climbed into his seat in the MCA. When after a rest, the lightened column again went on narrow roads. Lyashkevich whispered to me 52 people escaped. More from the construction battalion, but there are also real deserters. During the night, probably even more will leave. The column was still moving very slowly, even now when everyone was placed in cars. The road, unpaved, forested, partially washed out by rains, narrow and winding, did not allow to make more than 10 or 12 kilometers per hour. In the evening we decided to stop for the night not far from the small forest village of Novi Dvor. Belovishkaya Pusha is, in my opinion, one of the wonders of the world. It is difficult to describe this place. You have to visit it. Before the revolution, this whole forest belonged to the royal family. The senior forester was a friend of my father's from the university, and we sometimes came here to visit from Kovel, but I knew it only from stories. I was too young then. The Polish administration took great care of Bialowieza up to 1939, and when the whole area was again in the hands of the USSR, Bialowieza Forest was declared a state reserve. Bison lived here in special fenced areas of the forest. We saw several of these rare, large animals with mighty horns and manes from afar. The day passed quite calmly, as if there was no war. Several times we heard distant sounds of explosions or gunfire muffled by the forest. Sometimes we could hear passing airplanes. We could not see them from the forest, but here, under the vaults of mighty trees, there was silence. The column slowly crept along the forest roads, safely hidden from the pilot's gaze. A couple of times they stopped to organize meals. Although officially the column was a column of the fortification under the command of the chief of UR 84 Major General Puzyrev, but in fact it was a column of the construction department, and it was commanded by the chief engineer Lyashkevich. Lyashkevich was a native of these places and in his youthful years, before the revolution, lived in Kobrin. Cowardly, and as if indecisive or maybe too cautious, as chief engineer he suddenly turned into a strong-willed and skillful leader of the column, consisting of military, paramilitary workers, women, children and half-elderly from the construction units. In 24 hours he managed to create discipline and order, and to gain authority and general confidence. His orders were precise and concise, and I gladly carried them out. Lyashkevich was certainly good in his new position. Everyone was very tired and only dreamed of rest and sleep. In the forest we discovered a quite unique thing under every big spruce tree. There was like a big round room. The lower branches of the spruce, a quarter of a meter thick or more, went down and were hidden under a thick layer of fallen needles, and their ends came out again from under this cover, and almost vertically curved upward, forming a wall around. Some such rooms were as much as 30 meters in diameter. The floor was dry and elastic soft. Before going to bed, Lashkevich gathered all the commanders who had any official duties in the column to discuss the situation and outline the next day's actions. The reconnaissance, which had been sent almost to the northern edge of the forest, returned without having established contact with the command. The reconnaissance commander reported that he had encountered 2 small military groups trying to get to Gomel, but the commanders of both groups refused to join the Ura column, saying that it was easier for them to hope for success by staying in small units. There was no equipment for two-way radio communication in the column. There were a few ordinary radio receivers, but reception of the central radio stations of Moscow, Kiev and Minsk was very difficult, because there were no good antennas. We hastily made an antenna and raised it on one of the huge spruce trees. Reception improved considerably, but did not bring anything real. Propaganda hysteria, calls for calm, organization and vigilance were mixed with threats to the advancing insolent, arrogant fascists, with promises to destroy them and celebrate victory in Berlin in a month, and to the alarmists, provocateurs and saboteurs inside the country with promises of swift retribution, according to the laws of wartime. Even General Puzyrev himself, after listening to the program for a dozen minutes, waved his hand and said for the time being we must act ourselves there. It seems they have not yet organized themselves. As a result of the meeting, it was decided to go to Volkovisk in the morning, sending several reconnaissance detachments, and then, after receiving information from them, to choose the direction of further advancement of the column. Having surrounded the whole camp with a chain of guards, we went to our rooms under the spruce trees. In the morning I had a confrontation with Krasilnikov. He reported to Lyashkevich that 29 men had escaped from his detachment during the night, and the worst thing was that all of them were Polbatovs. Krasilnikov insisted on sending men to search for them, to catch them and bring them back, and then to try them as deserters. I doubted the expediency of such an undertaking. It turned out that yesterday, too, several men had escaped from the same detachment. In my detachment I have created a fighting group of Komsomol and party members, reliable people. They will find these deserters, and we will punish them roughly, Krasilnikov insisted. Maybe the creation of a special combat group is the reason why you, Captain Krasilnikov, have had people fleeing into the forest for 2 days in a row now, I remarked. Let's go to report to the general. Puzyrev listened to Krasilnikov, picking a toothpick in his teeth, rudely attacked him. And where did you look? Did you oversleep? Your men are your responsibility. If this happens again, I'll take you out of command of the squad. Understand? And looking for them here in the woods is like looking for a needle in a haystack. Go to your places, fellow commanders. We leave at 7:00. At 7:00, the column set out and crawled along the planned direction, and by 10 o'clock reached the road Volkovisk-Bereza-Kartuska. In another hour we were on the edge of the forest. We stopped at the place Izobolino, carefully hiding all the cars under the trees. People were given a strict order to stay in the forest and not to go to the open places. 3 scouts were sent out. The local population had no information about the Germans. There were almost no men to be seen, only old men, women and children. They were doing their usual chores. The local authorities from the village council could not be found either. Some said that they had gone to Volkovisk, others assumed that all the authorities had evacuated. One old man, smiling slyly, said we'd been hiding here at the Fox's place. Pokey dust spade. During the whole day we saw German airplanes only twice. They flew far behind Volkovisk. All 3 reconnaissance teams returned almost at the same time, and their reports showed that the road to Slonim and Baranovichi was relatively safe. The Germans sometimes bomb and shell the retreating units, but not particularly intensively, and if you do not go on the main roads, where a large concentration of retreating, you can skip. It was only necessary to cross the Zelvianka River somehow. It was the most dangerous place, because there, to 2 bridges near Zelva, flows of retreating military formations and masses of unorganized refugees flocked there. It was decided to try to cross the river at night. During the day they were often raided by German aviation, but the bridges were still intact. One lieutenant from the reconnaissance detachment established contact with representatives of the district command and gave General Puzarev the order to advance to Stolbcy and there to report to the headquarters of the 21st Army for further instructions. We left when it began to get dark. Puzarev was obviously nervous, the reliable shelter of the forest was over, the whole column went on the open roads. The next 3 days turned into a nightmare. From Volkovysk to Gomel, 450 kilometers, we moved mostly at night, in spurts, rushing from side to side, in panic, not knowing where the Germans and where the Soviet units, groping the road ahead and hiding from German aviation. It began almost immediately after the column had left Izabelin. When the column of the URA approached the outskirts of Volkovysk, the raid began. First flares were dropped, which hung over the town on parachutes, illuminating everything as if it were daytime. The light was so strong that one could read without difficulty. The road was in a field, and there was nowhere for the column to hide. Panic set in. Puzarev ordered all the cars to turn directly to the ploughed fields and, if possible, to move away from each other, and he himself, in a cotton jacket over his overcoat and helmet, ran away from the road and lay down near the bushes. The airplanes dropped bombs and something else, which slowly, like flakes glistening in the light of the rockets, settled on the ground. At once fires started in the city. In many places at once. The airplanes themselves could not be seen, as they were above the flares. The town was a little lower than the road, and the whole picture of its demise was clearly visible. There was no defence at all. Not a single shot from the ground, not a single plane of defence. The Germans circled over the burning Volkovysk for about 10 minutes and flew away. The city was burning like a bonfire. It took a long time until it was possible to collect cars on the road again. Several trucks had to be abandoned in the fields, as they were hopelessly stuck in sand and mud. People were reloaded, gasoline was drained, and spare tyres were removed. We reached Zelva in the morning. There was only one bridge left across the river in Zelva, a railroad bridge. The other wooden had been destroyed by a German raid the night before. The remaining bridge for one railroad track was uncovered, only sleepers and rails, and a narrow walkway of 2 planks between the rails. There was not even a railing on the bridge. In the place itself, in the surrounding gardens and groves, everywhere that could somehow hide from the gaze of the German pilots, everything was full of refugees and retreating scattered units. Many tried to cross the river wading or on rafts and boats, but this was available only to small groups without transportation and without cargo. The whole bank was heavily swamped, and in dry places it was covered with a thick layer of soft sand. Still, some organization of the crossing was established. At the exit to the bridge there was a strong guard under the command of some colonel, a brave and resolute man, who established strict control and order of priority in allowing those wishing to cross to the other side. Lyashkevich, Colonel Safronov, and I agreed with the commander of the bridge guard about the queue. The colonel, a young, tall, and remarkably handsome man, said the Germans do not intend to destroy the bridge. They are keeping it for themselves, that is clear. If they wanted to destroy the bridge, they could have done it in the first raid. They have a different tactic. Every 15 to 20 minutes, at least according to yesterday's experience, a couple of Messerschmitts come and fire machine guns. There, under the bridge, and further on the other side, there are a lot of crippled cars and beaten people. It is possible to cross this bridge. Even Yazes and Gazes pass over the sleepers. But it is necessary to get into the rhythm of their raids. Not many people are willing to go during the day. If you want to take risks, I can let your convoy through starting at 10 in the morning. Then again, staying until the next night is also a risk. The Germans might come this way. I don't know how fast and in what direction they're advancing. Decide for yourself and tell me no later than 7. A00 if it's going to be like yesterday. How many cars can get through in these 15 minutes without risk, Lyashkevich asked. I let 3 out at a time. If the cars are in order and the chauffeurs are on the Yatra, you can let 3 triples through. But see for yourself that the cars don't become and the chauffeurs are first class. This is your responsibility. We returned to Puzarev, gathered all the command staff and chauffeurs, and after discussion it was decided to cross in the afternoon. Women, children, and a few very old men were sent upstream in 2 cars, there being a narrow place and a small ferry. This group, with a platoon of Red Army soldiers, was to cross there, and the empty cars were to go back to the bridge. They checked all the cars, selected the best drivers, and lined up the whole column in the shade under the trees, not far from the bridge. Everything was ready for the crossing at the first signal. It was quite dawn. The last cars allowed on the bridge disappeared into the woods on the opposite side. Everything froze in anticipation of the first raid, but it was quiet and still. Chickens swarmed in the dust on the streets, piglets wandered lazily, sparrows flew by in flocks. Women were tending to their households, and children were playing, darting between the cars. It was even strange to look at hundreds of people, tensely waiting for the appearance of German pilots in the air. There's no time to waste. The hell they know. Maybe they won't even be here today. The commander of the crossing was nervous. Hey you, first 3, will you risk it? We'll try. Maybe we'll get through. Give the signal. Comrade Colonel and the chauffeurs of the first 3 in line got into the cabs and started the engines. The colonel went out to the platform, specially made to facilitate the exit of cars on the roadbed. He stood for a couple of minutes listening and looking up at the sky. Come on. Go full throttle. And he waved a green railroad flag. 2 1.5-ton Gazis and 1 3-ton Zs swiftly raced across the bridge, bouncing along the sleepers of the deck. The colonel waited until they were on the other side of the bridge and began to move away along the embankment across the meadows, toward the forest. Next 3. Gas up. Come on, don't hesitate. The second 3 also passed safely, followed by another one. When the fourth 3 cars already started their engines and began to go to the platform, the colonel suddenly waved a red flag back. Air. Handheld alarm sirens wailed, and everyone rushed under the shelter of trees and houses. 4 airplanes appeared above the valley. The bridge, the embankment behind the bridge, and the approach to the bridge were all empty. The airplanes made a large circle, somewhere far beyond the woods someone they began to bombard. It was clearly visible as they dive-bombed the target one after another, and then rose sharply, made a circle and dive-bombed again. The planes turned around, and all 4 in a row headed straight at us, toward the bridge. I, as well as several other commanders, took cover behind a large stack of sleepers near the bridge itself, but the Germans this time made a raid on the spot, apparently correctly assuming that here under the trees of the streets and gardens there was a cluster of retreating troops, and invisible from above. They swept over the settlement, each letting off a long machine gun burst. And all 4 disappeared into the distance. I ran to my column. On the street lay a few dead and wounded. In the houses cried children, screaming women. Probably there were victims there too. Turning into the alley where the of vehicles were parked, I saw the body of a military man lying on the corner. The man was face down, and a pool of blood was spreading out from under him. Bending down to the body to see if it was alive, I turned it face up. It was Yura Davidov, the same lieutenant from the 145th Division who had raped Raisia Mogolskaya in Vysokoye on May Day. He was dead. 2 soldiers and I moved the body to the side, took out the documents. His name was Georgy Davidiuk. The divisional commissar was right. Yuri Davidov wasn't on the division's rolls, but Georgy Davidiuk was. And now Davidiuk is out of the lists, but the maimed girl Raisia remained, I thought. There were no losses in the column, but the mood was very nervous. Part of the civilian workers said that they would go on foot to the ford and will cross there, and when General Puzarev said that he did not allow them to do so, came forward an elderly master, a turner from the mechanical workshops of the base, and calmly said, "And we don't need your permission yet. Comrade General, we are not military and we were subordinate to you, comrade, by service, by work, that means. Now there is no work. She's left in Cheremka. So we're on our own. Goodbye, comrades, let's go, guys," and they left. Discipline was noticeably falling. Even among the conscripts there were cases of refusal to obey their superiors. On that day it was difficult to establish any cyclicality in the periodic appearances of German aircraft. That they appeared after 10 to 15 minutes, then they were gone for a whole hour. Only once were several cars hit by a raid while on a bridge and embankment. 1 car went off the bridge and fell into the river. It was said that 11 people were killed on it, Another car went over the embankment and caught fire. There were killed and wounded there too. The turn for the crossing and the Ura columns was coming up. Instead of the colonel at the bridge exit, there was now a captain, one of the colonel's aides. Since the raids were very irregular, the captain let car after car onto the bridge at 5-minute intervals. The column of Urs pulled up to the bridge itself. 19 cars were selected for the crossing, the rest were not reliable. Again there was a mishap. 2 cars were on the embankment and a large 5-ton Yaz on the bridge when 2 Messerschmitts appeared in the air. The planes flew along over the embankment and the bridge. 1 car was hit on the embankment and the other hit the hit car from behind. The Yaz on the bridge became askew somehow, and one of its rear wheels hung in the air. Both the bridge and the embankment were completely blocked. The crossing chief, waving his red flag, shouted, "The crossing is closed. There is another bridge, 30 kilometers downstream. The crossing is closed." Our column was almost at the bridge. I looked at the Yaz on the bridge, the car was swaying, and I had a desperate thought. Without asking permission, I ordered Borisov standing next to me, "Get your men over here and gather volunteers. Let's dump the truck by hand. You see, it's swaying. Hurry up." In 10 minutes 40 men clothed the truck, began to rock it, and at last the truck flew off the bridge. But 2 people went down with it. One of them I knew well. Kolya Shuliakovsky, one of the military technicians who worked in the equipment group when I was its chief. Poor boy, he was still waiting to be promoted to the next rank. "As soon as I get it, I'll go home to Vinitsa and get married. I have a bride there. Alotka," he told me, showing me a card. Both cars were thrown off the embankment to the sides. The dead were taken down and laid in rows, covered with tarpaulins. The wounded were sent into the woods. It was as if the Germans were waiting for us to finish our work of clearing the bridge. As soon as the wounded were hidden at the edge of the forest, a trio of Messerschmitts appeared in the air, and on the bridge, and on the bridge, and on the embankment, and behind the bridge in the locality everywhere was empty. I was lying in the bushes of the vine and watched the airplanes. The whole 3 flew over the bridge without a single shot. 2 planes flew on, one made a circle, over the forest and flew once more over the bridge, as if making a check. Apparently the pilot noticed something and gave a long machine gun burst at the edge of the settlement, then disappeared, catching up with his fellow pilots. At last it was the turn of the Ur column to cross. 7 cars passed through without any trouble. The 8th one rolled down the embankment and got stuck in the swamp. The air alarm was given again, but 2 airplanes flew far away. They let the general's car pass. Then, without the permission of the guards, 3 brand new 1.5-ton Baziks jumped out from the side to the crossing. The first one, loaded with some boxes, with 2 lieutenants and a woman in a booth, and after it 2 more, filled with people. Many women, children with burdens, knots, men in military and civilian clothes. They sped safely across the bridge, but on the embankment they were overtaken by another raid. The first car fell off the embankment, tumbling over the side several times and losing all its load, and then started again on all 4 wheels at the bottom. The lieutenants jumped out of the cabin, examined the car, and drove straight across the meadow towards the woods. "What a marvel! I've never seen such a thing before in my life," said someone standing nearby. "And look how they drove. What a thing!" The other 2 cars came right under the machine guns. Both fell off the embankment, and from them people ran in all directions, carrying the wounded. From afar it was visible that there were many dead. The remaining vehicles of the Ur, a column began to pass one by one. Lashkevich and Borisov left in one of the last cars, and I was ordered to get into the last one. When this last car was given the signal to force the bridge, the driver flew by at full speed, forgetting to pick up me, Lieutenant Shmatko, the chief of the garage from the base in Cheremka, and 2 Red Army men from Borisov's detachment who were with me. After waiting for some time, we rushed to run across the bridge to the other side, followed by several more men, homeless as we called loners who did not belong to any particular unit or organization. After running across the bridge, we ran off the embankment. There was a good path below, straight across the meadow towards the woods. Here we came upon one of the cars that had made it across the crossing without a line. Around the overturned car, among all sorts of things, knots and baskets, lay 3 dead men. At the edge of the path lay a woman with her bare legs sticking out unpleasantly from under her skirt, and I bent down to cover her. And behind her body, half covered by a fallen knot, was a child, still alive. A boy, probably about 4 years old. His whole lower body was a solid gash, one leg was completely splintered, and a broken bone was sticking out. Everything was bloody. His eyelids on his half-closed eyes fluttered a little, and the fingers on both of his arms spread apart, clenched and unclenched. "The kid is coming to, and you can't touch him. He's bleeding out," said an elderly senior sergeant, a homeless man who had joined our group. "He'll die now. Or maybe he'll suffer for another hour or more. Look how white he is." He looked at the sky, then at us, and took out a nagant from his holster. "Go ahead, boys. It's not nice to look at such a thing. Go on. You can't do anything anyway. And it, the little child, may be suffering still." We all rushed forward along the path. I saw how the sergeant, without removing his cap from his head, crossed himself. When I turned my head after the shot, I saw him walking straight across the meadow away from us. He did not want to meet us again. We caught up with our column gathering in the woods after crossing the bridge. We were already not far from Slonim. Many people were lost, or maybe they decided to act on their own, like those workers who left Zelva. Finally, contact with the command was established. Puzyrev received orders, instructions, directions, and a whole big packet of mail sent to the fortification before the war. In the bundle of circulars, relations, and other official bureaucracy of pre-war everyday life, there was an order to produce junior military technician Nikolai Shuliakovsky in the rank of military technician. There was also a new order that now, instead of the rank of military engineer of the 3rd rank, the rank of engineer captain was established, and, accordingly, a military engineer of the 2nd rank was an engineer major, and a military engineer of the 1st rank was an engineer colonel. All Stroviks, Polbatovci and Strojbatovci were ordered to go under the command of one of the senior commanders to Baranovici at the disposal of the command of the 137th Division. All other military and civilian employees of the URA and the construction department under the command of General Puzyrev were ordered to move through Novogrudok to Minsk. Families, women and civilians after the age of 55 were to be loaded on a train here in Slonim to be sent to the rear. Puzyrev began to carry out the order immediately. All the construction workers under Colonel Safronov's command left at once in the direction of Baranovici. Families and old people were taken to the station and put in the care of the commandant. The rest of the engineering staff, with a platoon of guards, loaded onto 15 vehicles and set out in the direction of Novogrudok. Puzyrev showed great energy and perseverance. He fully assumed command. "You, Engineer Colonel, now rest in the car, and in the morning replace me," he said, Lyashkovich. But neither I nor Borisov received rest. Both of us were ordered to go together with the general, but not in the car, but standing on the footrests on both sides of the cabin and holding on to the body. We left Slonim when it began to get dark. All the cars were going without lights, at low speed. In front was a 1.5-ton truck with a part of the guard platoon, then the general's car, and then the rest of the column. In the middle of the night we approached Novogrudok. There we learned that not far to the north large German forces had been spotted. Some army captain reported to Puzyrev, "Comrade General, I have accurate reports. Large forces are moving in the direction of Minsk. The Germans have a lot of tanks. They are moving in a narrow wedge, not forming a front. There aren't many of our units here. Let's retreat to Stolpci." Puzyrev woke Lyashkovich. It was decided to turn immediately to the east to Stolpci and, taking advantage of the darkness, to go to the main road to increase the speed of the column. It was a big mistake. Here, on the main road Novogrudok-Stolpci, it was not a retreat, but a flight. The night was quite bright, and in the ghostly semi-darkness, in 3 or 4 rows along the road, from side of the road to side of the road, there were scattered military units, cars, wagons, crowds of pedestrians, with their belongings on their shoulders or in handcarts. There was a lot of local Jewish population, as there were rumours that the Germans were exterminating the Jews. Shouting, yelling, cursing. Cars were bumping into each other. Wagons were hitched. Overturned cars were lying on both sides of the road. Carts with broken wheels. Some people were sitting and lying down. Children were crying. Women were sobbing. And over all this chaos in the air hung the famous Russian mat. All this mass moved terribly slowly, with endless stops, jams, disorganized and in complete panic. It was said that at dawn we should expect raids, and then we will all perish here. At one of the jams, General Puzyrev got out of his car and began to command. But his intervention was met with such a scolding, such an explosion of indignation against the superiors in general and the military in particular, that he, saving his general's prestige, or perhaps fearing for his own skin, hurried back into the car under the hooting of a very hostile crowd. And it was impossible to escape from this panic flow. In front, obviously for many kilometers, it was the same. More and more crowds were coming from behind. All the time the road went in a rather deep notch, and such a slope the cars could not take. It was necessary at all costs to get out of this panic chaos somewhere to the side and before full dawn. It was frightening to think of what just one pair of Messerschmitts could do here. But that's exactly what happened. The sun had not yet risen. As far ahead, against the background of clouds pink from the dawn, showed 3 airplanes. They flew sideways, then closer, and turning around, rushed into the attack. People, leaving their cars, carts and belongings, ran to the sides along the slopes of the notch. Fortunately for us, the main blows came well ahead, and here, above the column of A, only one plane flew over and gave a long machine gun line. Above the road was one multi-voiced shriek. I was again, as at the raid on Cheremka, struck by a nasty, irresistible shiver. After all, they will be back. And soon. Too tempting a target, I thought, surveying the panorama of chaos on the road from the top of the notch. About 20 paces away from me, on the right side of the notch, a path about 1.5 meters wide descended to the road. If we widen it, we can take our cars up into the Nola and into the same woods. Oh my goodness! Men and shovels. We've got it all. I ran downstairs to Puzyrev's car. In the booth sat the general and Lashkevich, with faces literally grey from the experience of fear. Comrade General, there is a way out of this mousetrap. Comrade Lyashkevich, get out quickly and give a command. 50 men with shovels organize. Give the team in my name. I give you full freedom of action, Pali. They, those be. And they're coming again. Come on, do it, the general backed up, grunting and swearing, and climbed out of his car. In half an hour our cars, pushed by dozens of people, one after another crawled to the top of the excavation and hid under the trees of a small grove. Cheerful general loudly announced, I declare Engineer Captain Paliu gratitude. For the second time he has shown ingenuity in a difficult situation. It's dangerous to stay here for long. We must chart a path and leave quickly. Look, in half an hour there will be more men than trees in this grove, said Lyashkevich. Indeed, there were 2 more attacks on the road, one somewhere far ahead and the other quite close, behind from where we made an exit for our vehicles. The road was completely blocked with wrecked cars, carts and the corpses of horses and men. People, having abandoned everything, were scattering in all directions, and for many people our grove was a welcome shelter. Lyashkevich looked at the map for a long time, finally gave the command to move. Let's go on field roads to the southeast, with large gaps between cars, leaving communication and beacons at turns and forks. By evening we reached the village of Kopil, not far from Slutsk. Everyone was completely exhausted, especially the drivers. They needed a rest. Staggering from exhaustion, I found my overcoat, and saying to Lyashkevich, I will sleep in this shed. I entered some building and, wrapping myself up, as it was cool and drizzling, fell on the floor by the wall and instantly fell asleep. I awoke at dawn. I slept well, but I didn't feel like getting up. Maybe I'll nap a little longer, I thought, and turned around. My cheek touched something soft. It turned out I'd slept all night on a big pile of fresh dung. My clothes, overcoat, underwear, even my socks, everything was soaked with the sharp smell of manure. I washed myself, washed my belongings and underwear, but my overcoat had to be thrown away. Puzyrev ordered to move to Slutsk and Gomel. Again the column went along field roads, rarely meeting small groups of refugees or military formations. Communication with the command was again lost. We moved very slowly, both because of the condition of the roads, a little washed out by the night rain, and because of the frequent stops. As soon as a German airplane appeared anywhere, all the vehicles stopped, moving off to the side of the road. Each car was covered with a whole pile of fresh branches and must have looked like a big bush from above. Apparently it did, because not once did the airplanes attack the column. Before Slutsk, the column came to the railroad line. Between two gentle hills there was a small station, a water pump, and a village all drowned in gardens. On the top of one hill was a cemetery, all overgrown with thick trees. We decided to stop here till evening, and then overnight to get to Gomel. I sat on the edge of the cemetery, under the trees, and looked at the station. The distance was no more than 1.5 kilometers. Empty tracks, a couple of freight cars on the spare line. On the platform on a bench sat 2 people. The village was also as if extinct, rarely a human figure appeared. I wanted to write a letter to my wife to send from Gomel, but several commanders came up. They were all struck by the fact that during the whole 5 days of our escape we had never once seen our Soviet aviation in the air. One of them said, "Where are they, our proud falcons? No front, no organization, no troops, no superiors, and not a single airplane," and another added, "This means that we won't give a single inch of our land to the enemy, and we'll beat him on his territory." Suddenly a steam locomotive horn sounded, and a long train of freight cars with several class cars at the end began to crawl out from behind the hill. The steam locomotive came to a water pump and began to draw water, and people, almost all women and children, spilled out of all the cars. This was, of course, the train with the evacuated families. There was growing excitement among us. It was so unnaturally foolish and imprudent to send a train out in broad daylight, and even with such passengers. The train presented a tempting target for German aviation. General Puzyrev came, looked at it, and sent 2 commanders in his armoured MK with an order to the commandant of the train to immediately remove the train from the station and to stop for the day in the forest, seen further towards Slutsk. But no sooner had the car reached the station than the observers gave the alarm air. Air. Everybody under cover. A formation of 3 airplanes was flying quite far away. At the station, too, they noticed them, and the crowd on the track scattered. Some rushed to the cars, others ran in different directions to the village, to the fields surrounding the station. Messerschmitts flew unnaturally slow, or so it seemed, looking for victims. German planes were attacking the station. The first reaction of most in our well-camouflaged column was to divert the German pilot's attention away from the train of women and children toward us. Roll the cars out into the field. In the open. There are children there, women. Maybe ours are there too, come on. Start the engines, someone gave a command. But Puzyrev forbade, do not open the cloak. Get back. I'll shoot, he yelled. The planes made a circle and again began to dive one after another on the station. A sort of general hysteria went up. People, as they stood, barefoot, half undressed, rushed to run across the field down to the station, on the run firing rifles, pistols and automatic rifles, whoever had them. Why everyone was running, what they could do against the German pilots flying at an unreachable height, no one thought about it. Some spontaneous, instinctive feeling pushed everyone to do something, somehow to prevent this terrible destruction of children and women, somehow to divert the attention of the killers to another target, to themselves. I ran along with the others, firing my Tuliak into the air. Next to me ran, shooting on the move, a young sergeant whom I knew from the base. He was a Komsomol organizer in the security detachment. An insolent and generally unpleasant subject, he now, having shot all his cartridges, launched his gun toward the airplanes, stopped and cried, "Oh, beat them, sods! Damn them! Brutes, Mora run them over, damn them." And in helplessness he sat down on the ground. At the station, on the platform, and on the tracks, lay the dead and wounded, and the planes were making their 3rd run. Bullets hit the steam locomotive, and it was enveloped in clouds of steam. Suddenly, amidst the shouts of the fleeing men, the murmur of the aircraft engines, the gunfire and the whistle of steam escaping from the boiler, there was a new sound, the distinctive consonant chatter of a counter-aircraft machine gun. It was firing from another hill on the other side of the station. One of the planes, on coming out of the dive, got a line it smoked, rose still higher, turned over, and began to descend rapidly. 2 dots separated from it, the pilots jumped out on parachutes, and the plane crashed to the ground and exploded. The parachutes were blown by the wind straight in our direction, towards the cemetery. The other 2 planes split up. One flew to the place from where the anti-aircraft installation was firing, shelled the place with a machine gun, and dropped 3 small bombs, tin cans. The other one, descending heavily, made several circles over the field where the parachutists landed, fired a machine gun at the people running to the parachutists and flew away. Had it not been for Puzyrev's order to take the pilots alive, they would have been torn to pieces by the men from our column who were running from all sides. There were 2 of them, in good flying uniforms, high fur boots and black leather helmets. One a large, red-haired man with a red-weathered face, the other a small, fidgety, monkey-like brunette, considerably younger. They took away documents, weapons, personal belongings. The redhead was a major, a link commander. The little one was a non-commissioned officer, a machine gunner. They brought them to Puzyrev. It turned out that our general speaks German quite fluently, so he himself began to interrogate the captured pilots. After a few questions, Puzyrev called one of the commanders, a Jew who knew German well, and ordered to make a full interrogation. Then he looked around at the crowd standing around him and said, "We will be judged according to all the rules of military field jurisdiction," and immediately appointed a court of law, presided over by a military lawyer from the construction department, a lieutenant colonel. The cries of "Air! Air!" rang out again, and everyone took cover under the cemetery trees. I thought that if it had not been for the muzzles aimed at the heads of the prisoners, especially at the red-haired major, he would not have thought for a moment to give any signal to the pilots that a whole military unit had taken refuge here, under the dense trees, even at the risk to his own life in the raid. The planes, 2 fighters and 1 larger one, circled the whole field several times at low altitude. 2 flew away, and 1, having made a great circle around the neighborhood, came back again and continued its search for about 10 minutes. At last it too flew away. The red-haired major was a squadron commander, a cadre pilot. He demanded that he and a non-commissioned officer, a machine gunner, be interned in a POW camp and refused to answer any questions from the investigator and the judges. Only when asked if he saw that the attack was directed against defenseless women and children, did he say that his task was to destroy military personnel and block the railroad track, and that the deaths of a few non-military residents were quite normal in such an operation. He held himself with great dignity, looked contemptuously at his judges, and smoked cigarette after cigarette, perhaps only in this way giving away his excitement. The swarthy, fidgety non-commissioned officer, the machine gunner, on the contrary, was very talkative, terribly nervous, trying to prove that he only carried out the commander's orders, and was not guilty of anything. Puzyrev appointed me to the court. Obviously, after my 2 heroic deeds, he remembered my name well and gained respect for my person. 2 investigators in the afternoon prepared all the material for the trial. At the station there were 41 people killed, 16 children, 21 women and 4 men, 2 railroad workers and 2 soldiers. The steam locomotive was wrecked, also 7 cars. The main tracks are completely blocked. The wounded, totaling 36 people, women, children and 2 locals, were sent in collective farm cars to Slutsk. The last 2 wagons bore Red Cross signs. The prosecutor, one of the lawyers of the directorate, argued that it was clear to the commander of the attacking German planes that the purpose of their attack was the refugee train, which posed no military danger, and that by organizing the raid and shelling of the peaceful defenseless population, he, a major, had violated such and such articles of international laws, and his actions were clearly criminal in nature, incompatible with the rank of an officer, and not compelled by circumstances. During the investigation and repeated interrogations of the non-commissioned machine gunner officer, It became clear that the major had ordered him to concentrate his fire directly on the railroad train, and that the firing on the fleeing women and children was an initiative of the non-commissioned officer himself, which, however, the major did not forbid. Prosecutor demanded the death penalty for both prisoners. Defense counsel, without disputing the data of the investigation, insisted on the transfer of the prisoners to the rear military authorities, expressing doubts as to the legality of the sentence. The major behaved defiantly, categorically recognizing neither the legality of this hastily assembled military tribunal nor its right to decide his fate. At one point he irritably interrupted the presiding officer and said that he was a soldier and was following orders from his command, and that in modern warfare there is no such thing as a civilian population. Everything on the other side of the line separating the rows of soldiers facing each other with weapons in their hands is an enemy force, active or potential. Puzyrev approved the court's decision, making a note to reassure the defender that he fully assumes responsibility for the legality of the proceedings. The interpreters, who translated every word to the Germans during the court session, translated the decision and read both texts in front of the formation. Puzyrev obviously liked pomp. There were many times more volunteers than were needed to carry out the court's sentence. They were shot in the evening. The major behaved like a soldier until the last moment, even in his own majestic way, and stood at gunpoint calmly, with a cigarette in his mouth. The non-commissioned officer cried, fell on his knees, begged for mercy, tried to break free. He was tied to a tree. The corpses of those shot were placed by the road, and nearby, by order of the general, a piece of cardboard with an inscription in 2 languages, for what and by whom these 2 men were shot, was nailed to a pole. I asked Lashkevich if we had the right, in his opinion, to do that to the German pilots. He answered, I think not. But who cares about that, and our general knew that anyway it was impossible to bring them alive somewhere legally, they would have been killed without a trial. And so at least the semblance of discipline and leadership was observed. Already at dusk our column moved bypassing Slutsk to Gomel. On the road, near the column, 2 shot Germans were lying almost naked. Fur boots, flight overalls, woolen socks and other things attracted someone's greedy eyes and hands. Before we left, they sent a small detachment to bury all those killed at Pokrashevo station, 41 people and 1 common grave. June 27, 1941.